Welcome everyone to Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Translation. I'm one of your speakers, Tyler Pugmire.
And Peter Lee. So the first thing I want to bring up is the goal and the challenges of translating Harry Potter series. So the goal mainly is to adapt text from English to other languages and other cultures. And so, but the most important thing in the meantime is to make a good assumption about Rowling's intentions while translating it. And there are two main challenges of translating a Harry Potter series. So the first one is inventive words and alliterations, and the second one is British cultural references. So the first thing I want to talk about in a Harry Potter series is characters' names. So the conventional names like Harry, Ron, and Hermione actually
They're very common names.
Yeah, so there are no major changes in the translations versions. But take Severus Snape as an example. This name actually carries meaning. It means severity as snake. But in the Italian version, it was translated to Severus Piton, which means python. And in the Hungarian version, it was translated to Severus Rogue, which means Severus arrogance. So for both of the versions, they try to they attempt to preserve the meaning of snake, but both loses the alliteration. So the first invented word I want to talk about is Hogwarts, the School of Wizardry. So in most languages, the names stay the same, but if someone doesn't know English, it basically loses the connotations to those foreign readers. In French version, it attempts to preserve the meaning by calling it boulard, and the French word boulard, which actually means slice of fat or bacon. And the Hungarian version, it is called Roxford, which is made up of Oxford and Rockford. So for both of the versions, like for French version, you try to preserve the meaning of pig, which is similar as hog. And for Hungarian version, they use a famous British university, Oxford, as a representation of the school, and Rockford, a well-known blue cheese, to describe the overall appearance and the shape of the schools. So the second invented word I want to talk about is a popular ball game in Harry Potter series, the Quidditch, which is made up of three words: quaffle, bludger, and snitch, which are basically three kinds of balls in the game. And so in the Spanish, the words were not actually changed. And in French, the Quidditch was kept, but the names of the three balls were changed. But in some other languages, the name of the game was even changed. For example, in Dutch, the name was changed to Zirkbal, and in Norwegian, it's changed to Rotterdam. So for British cultural references, the thing I want to talk about is about the food items. So some of the food items were changed in order to make those foreign readers more familiar with their culture and to make it some more indigenous. So for example, a famous popular candy in Britain, Sherbet Lemons, was actually translated to Tremble in Israel version. And simple changes like crisps to chips in US, and also Arabic version, the bacon was translated to egg since it's a taboo in most of the Middle East countries.
One other place that culture can actually affect translation happens in a lot of examples. But our main example for tonight is relating to A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. So now if we want to get into those cultural references, basically, for some background, translation has affected A Song of Ice and Fire in many ways. First of all of the names at the beginning of all the translations, as soon as the book rolled out, they kept all the English names. And this was both good and bad. It was good because every single language had the same unit and compact name, and everyone could agree upon something. But some argued that it led to the Game of Thrones world being limited to only where people could speak either English, the language of Volantis, or the language of the Dothraki. Moving on, The translation has affected A Song of Ice and Fire in other ways. In 2011, ever since the book rolled out, they actually decided to change that, both the house names and the actual names of the characters in many of the languages. For example, the Erie ended up becoming the Hohener, which directly translates to high honor, which sounds pretty good, but we'll get into that later. And Jon Snow ended up becoming Jon Schnee. Both of these translations coming in the German version of the book. But why are these translations significant? Well, for one, the Erie loses its meaning. As you can tell by the picture right here, this is somewhere that the reader and soldiers visiting do not want to interact with. The Erie has this eerie and creepy feeling to it. No one really wants to go there. But in German, when they use the word Hohener, which translates to high honor, the word for eerie and creepy in German is actually unheimlich. Not really the same thing, which basically leads this house to no longer have the name of the house to describe the environment that surrounds it and what they pride themselves on. Now, the translation for Jon Schnee is significant because they actually changed his name, his last name only, directly translated Schnee to snow, but in the cultural context of it, in the spoken version in the translated television series, they still call him Jon Schnee. So regardless of the direct translation of Schnee to snow, they didn't culturally translate it to make the hard J turn into a soft and turning it into Jan or Johann, something that would be traditional in German culture today. But moving on, there are even more examples of the translation changing meaning. For example, King's Landing in German translated to Königsmund, which no longer referred to Aegon's Landing, but instead the delta of the River of the King. That loses the meaning or the reference back to King's Landing being settled by Aegon in before A Song of Ice and Fire was written. It loses meaning of the text. In Norwegian, Highgarden is referred to as Rosenhøy, or a mountain of roses. This basically loses all the respect that people have for Highgarden that read this in Norwegian, because this gives in the context that this is a group of people, a group of hippies with flower power. Now moving on, if you could go back one. The French translation of the word kraken directly translates to cuttlefish. That's just clearly wrong. And in German, the Dreadfort became Grauenstein, which directly translates to Greystone. But what we understand is that this basically loses meaning of the Dreadfort, the place where people are killed and tortured and eaten by dogs. But it's called Greystone now instead of the Dreadfort. That basically loses its contextual meaning. Now if we can move on. What have been the pros of these translations? Well, for some people who are reading these Norwegian and French translations, the translators decided to take George R.R. Martin's words and kind of spin them in a medieval fashion. Which I guess this is good because it allowed these Norwegian and French readers to kind of relate more with the Stark family, which is probably a good thing. The Norwegian version also translated Ghost's name into Skromt, meaning wrath, because, in the Norwegian language, the actual word for ghost isn't really something that's intimidating. Rather, the word wrath is. What we see in this context is that it doesn't really change the storyline of anything, but instead it provides a better effect on the listener. And finally, the Dutch version translated the names of the houses because of the relative common adjective, verbs, and nouns that are used with each. For example, Winterfell, River Run, and the character Littlefinger. These are all fairly simple and don't really have any background or figurative meanings, and so they're very easy to translate. And finally, how can we solve this conflict? But if we're being honest, there's no real way to solve this conflict. There's no crystal clear solution. When we understand, there's only some references that we can give. First of all, there needs to be a judgment call between whether it needs to be a direct translation, a translation for cultural context, or no translation at all and instead just leave the names as they are. Then there needs to be a discussion of what needs to stay the same because of either specific intent or something like what happened with Severus Snape and the alliteration or the symbolism of the effect.
And so in Harry Potter series, there are several solutions shown up. And for Chinese version, they actually use footnotes under the text to explain the meaning and the cultural references. And in Spanish translations, they simply use italics to tell the readers that there are words that are culturally referred.
And while there is no clear way to solve for all of this, these discussions that we are having now is actually what's going to help the future, regardless if you speak French, Portuguese, Dutch, Norwegian, to have the same effect on the listener. Language shouldn't be the boundary between you and reading a good book, but instead we should be improving this by having these progressive and more meaningful translations. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if you could just please get to the works cited pages.